This is a bar called Rogers Roundhouse in Fort Worth, Texas. This is Jose Altuve of the Houston Astros. What do these things have in common? Glad you asked. In October of 2021, the Astros were playing in the ALCS. I had made a plan to meet up with one of my friends for the game, which was at night. Now, the unfortunate problem was I decided to drink by myself throughout the day, probably like 5 to 6 beers. So when I did meet up with my friend, I was already pretty intoxicated, generally incoherent, and essentially it robbed me of meaningful interaction. So that night, I had to take an Uber home. The next day, my wife had to drive me to pick up my car, and I would not call this a high point of 2021. As I was driving home that day, I thought a lot about accountability around drinking and addiction. I was not yet ready to call myself an addict. I have since done that, but it took more time. Now that's a big word, accountability. Okay, so what exactly does accountability mean? In the context of addiction, I would say it probably refers to biology, nurture or experiences, the idea of a moral failing, the idea of a personal failing, etc. These are the ways you commonly hear it described. Now, personally, I feel like addiction constitutes a wide variety of things. And in fact, that same Astros day when I was driving home, I was thinking about it so much that I wrote a Medium post about addiction and accountability and whether we do it to ourselves. Let me show you 2 paragraphs from that post. As you can see in this first paragraph, oftentimes I really dislike myself and have low self-esteem. Even since I stopped drinking, this can still permeate. That's probably a factor of biology, nurture, and experiences, and maybe a bit of societal failure around people's ability to reach out to each other and care. In this paragraph, I think it's kind of similar to school shooters in a way. We don't often think about the path someone went on from A to B. I didn't want to be a drunken mess slurring at an Astros game when I was 40. I wanted to be something else, but I got waylaid just like someone in Philadelphia's Kensington neighborhood might. I don't think we can ever solve the issue of who has ultimate accountability for addiction. I think it varies by your perspective and your experiences. What we can do, though, is realize that biology does play a role, and addiction can easily be classified as a disease. In fact, the American Addiction Centers has more on this.
Addiction is a disease. There's plenty of debate out there as to why and how addiction to drugs and alcohol can be considered a disease. Some argue that it's not something you can catch, like a cold or the flu, and that calling it a disease is an excuse. One YouTuber calls out the disease debate into question and defends his point by insisting that choice is the main factor when it comes to addiction. Choice can certainly be a factor, but that doesn't dig deep enough when considering the serious problem of addiction. I think it's best to first look at what is considered a disease in the first place. We asked Dr. Tom Daub, the Chief Clinical Officer and Chief Compliance Officer for American Addiction Centers, what is a disease?
So a disease, the American Medical Association looks at a few factors when thinking about what actually constitutes a disease. First, it's really about looking at something that's wrong with the body, some dysfunction of the body. Second, that dysfunction has to have certain signs and symptoms that are consistent that define the disease. And third, it really has to cause harm to the body in some way.
So broadly you can call addiction a disease, even if some people want to frame it up as a choice. I think addicts make choices, but the 35,000-foot picture is that it's a disease you're operating under. It's hard to stop, even if you know stopping would be better for you. If you're in recovery or you've experienced problems with addiction yourself or in your family, you've probably seen that. You feel like you say to yourself 10,000 times, or you say to someone you love 10,000 times, like, why don't you just stop? Well, it's not that simple. So I called this channel the Recovery Chronicles because I wanted to put some of these ideas into the context of recovery. And I think changing the frame on what addiction is kind of changes the stigma in many ways. It helps you to recover from it. Here's a clip about what addiction is and how to think about it.
The main thing that people need to understand in working with people in recovery is that addiction is a health issue not a moral issue. And it's nothing to do with a person's moral character. It is a health issue. It is a disease, and it needs to be treated as such. You know, so often addiction is treated like something that the person did bad. It's a bad thing they've done, and they need to clean up their act. And it's the only disease that a person gets punished for relapsing. For relapsing, you know, I'm a diabetic, and if I got go on for every time I ate a cookie, if they told me you're not going to get any insulin, Sterling, you ate a cookie, I'd be in trouble.
What's the lesson here if you're in recovery then? I would say don't think of yourself as a scourge on society or a moral failure, even if that seems to be the landscape others want to assign to you. Think of yourself as a person with a disease trying to be better. Okay, so let's say you're friends with someone in recovery, or you're friends with someone that's maybe even in the throes of addiction, right? This is obviously a really hard situation. I know I've put a lot of my friends through it as well when I was going through it. And I also realize people get busy with their own lives, and sometimes they don't want to deal with a person that's consistently making the same mistakes as an addict, right? That's completely logical. Now, we'll cover this in future videos on this channel, but I would argue that the opposite of addiction isn't necessarily sobriety, it's actually connection. So while it can feel paradoxical to reach out to someone that you feel like is being an idiot or screwing up their own lives, and you're busy with your own kids and professional responsibilities and everything that comes with that, it's actually smarter to reach out to people and to try to be there for them. That's gonna kind of help them beat the addiction sooner than kind of penalizing them emotionally or socially.
And what I try to do now, and I can't tell you I do it consistently and I can't tell you it's easy, is to say to the addicts in my life that I want to deepen the connection with them, to say to them, I love you whether you're using or you're not. I love you whatever state you're in, and if you need me, I'll come and sit with you because I love you and I don't want you to be alone or to feel alone. And I think the core of that message, you're not alone, we love you, has to be at every level of how we respond to addicts, socially, politically, and individually.
So the bigger picture is, I do think we can classify addiction as a disease. I do think it's something that people go through. And I do think it's something that people have a hard time having control over. So if you have friends that are addicts or in recovery or trying to better their lives, just have that understanding. They're not necessarily just a complete F up. Sometimes it's something that they have a hard time controlling. If you're in recovery, try to see yourself in that light. You're not a social scourge, you're not a demon, you're not anything like that. You're someone that struggled with something. That's all it is, and if we could have a greater understanding around that and reduce the stigma, I feel like we'd all be better off. All right, until next time, this is Recovery Chronicles.